So I'm glad to present to you tonight Dr. Iris DeRoe and her presentation regarding the French perspective of Yorktown. Please give her a hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jeff, for organizing this and for showing me all the beautiful places around Yorktown and around Williamsburg yesterday and tomorrow as a whole other program of this beautiful region that is so full of history, of course. And as someone that has studied the French campaign so much, it's so special to be on the ground and to actually see what the French have seen, what they have thought about all these different places, but also to actually understand the Battle of Yorktown so much better by going to the readouts, by going to the different places, to imagine the distances, to imagine how large these encampments were, to visualize sort of in my head then, but to see all these thousands of men fighting. So it's very special to be here, and it's a real honor to be on this site tonight. For me, of course, studying Yorktown from France has been quite the challenge sometimes. So to be here is very special. So thank you so much for the invitation. And so what I'll present today is a part of my research on Châtelus, that complicated name to pronounce. You write Chastellux, but you say Châtelus, and it's terrible to remember for most people, but here we go, Châtelus. And I'm also going to focus a little bit less, but also on Vieux-Mesnil, who is someone that I've been recently doing more research on. So I'll focus mainly on the Yorktown campaign, so I'll focus on the preparation phase of the campaign and then on the actual battle itself through the eyes of Châtelus and Vieux-Mesnil. But before I start, I would like to tell a little anecdote on why I've done the research on Châtelus. So as has been said, I've done my PhD research on him and then published a book on him, and now I'm writing an English book on him and those he was working with. So Vieux-Mesnil is part of that, but especially doing much more research on Rochambeau as well today, and on the French ambassador who is called La Luzerne, but that's all for another time. But Châtelus, of course, you might wonder, who is he? You might know his travel diary. Here, just now, there was already, at the time, some people that knew you were just introducing me to a letter that you found. Very interesting letter. It's right here from Nelson from Yorktown that actually read the travel diary of Châtelus that was known at the time. But for now, a lot of people have never heard of Châtelus, so probably most of you have not. So to tell you why I have done the research, we have to go back to Burgundy, where I was living. But first I want to put the attention on the fact that they are on this painting that you all know of course, the surrender of Cornwallis. And the two people I'm going to focus on today, Châtelus and Vieux-Mesnil, are on this painting. And I'm sure you've never noticed, but here they are, these two gentlemen from France, of course, that are standing there on the side of the French during this important moment, of course, of this last major battle of the American Revolution. So François-Jean de Châtelus, we're going to start with him. Here you can see my book, of course, a little promotion for that. But so here's a book, Un soldat philosophe dans le monde atlantique à l'époque des Lumières, as has been mentioned. So it's the book, it's really a biography on him, because it all starts here. So this is the home I grew up in Burgundy. My parents, I was born in Utrecht in the Netherlands, but then they bought this home in France for the holidays. And so what you can see on the picture is a huge tree. The tree is a tulip poplar. And the tulip poplar is quite well known in Virginia, and in French it's called un tulipier de Virginie. So it's actually a tree from Virginia, specifically in France. And the people in the village told me that it was planted by Lafayette himself 200 plus years ago. And you have to stand with about, I think I put a picture, yeah, so you can see, like, if you stand next to it, it's really big. You have to stand with 6 people around it. And it is indeed over 200 years old. But so when I grew up, I wondered, is that really Lafayette that planted that? Or how did this story start? And so I went to Dijon, which is not far away. Dijon, known for the mustard by most of you. But they also have archives, and I found that the person who was living in our home at the time, in the 18th century, was not connected to Lafayette, but he was connected to his uncle by marriage. His name is Châtelus, so the one that I will talk about today. And so François-Jean de Châtelus was someone I had never heard of, but there was a correspondence between him and the person that was living in our home because it was the same region. So Châtelus was of course of a very high nobility, but then the people living in our home were of a lower nobility, but they were related because it was in Burgundy in one of these regions. And so when I saw the name Châtelus, I was like, hey, there's a village close by called Châtelus. Let's go and find out more. So there was indeed the connection with Lafayette that's important to understand, because that's of course how the story of the Lafayette tree sort of was born, because they're related. I will not explain very much in detail. If you're interested, I can tell you later, but the fact is that Adrienne de Noailles is the niece of François-Jean Châtelus. So Châtelus and her share their grandfather. And so of course when Lafayette marries Adrienne de Noailles becomes close to Châtelus. There, of course, there's a big generation gap. It's like almost same age as Washington Lafayette's difference, but so he is an older uncle and he becomes close to him from the beginning, and especially during the Revolution, they are often together, as we'll see later. So there is this village, Châtelus, close to our home, and what I knew is that there was this castle, but I didn't know much more about it. So I went and literally knocked on the door and met the owner, called Philippe de Châtelus, living in this beautiful castle, and his family has been living in it since over 1,000 years. This is not just sort of a myth, it's actually true. There are a few of these French families still today that are living from generation to generation to generation in castles, like this one, Le Château de Châtelus. And so Philippe told me, when I asked him or told him about our tree, he said, we have the same tree in our garden. So he showed me his tulip poplar, and of course we became immediate friends because of this. And then he told me about François-Jean Châtelus. I was like, who is that, and why is this tree, and what did he do in America? So he told me about his ancestor being, of course, a major general serving under Rochambeau, fighting in the American Revolution, and he told me he had lived for 3 years in Mount Vernon. Not true, he stayed 2 nights, but okay, that's the family legend at least. And so he gave me just so that you know where it is, based in France, kind of in between Lyon and Paris, as you can see. So here's Philippe. I just have fun photos, so that's what, so here he is, Philippe de Châtelus. But so what he did is he gave me his travel journal that is published, that you might have heard of, which is a book that describes 3 travels that Châtelus has made during his American campaign. So he was of course serving under Rochambeau, but in a few times he went away and traveled along the different states. And I will talk to you more about the book, but it really was an intriguing book to me because I did not know much about the revolution nor about the French in the revolution. But when I read this when I was about 18, 19 years old, I got very intrigued by the detail, by the fun descriptions of all the different towns and the people, and he's going to George Washington, to Thomas Jefferson, to Thomas Paine, and all these names that I had of course heard of, and I thought, who is this person? How did he go to all these different famous Americans of the time, and how is he well received everywhere? And so he's describing the different states, how they look, the differences between the different people, describing the different state constitutions, and it's a very just intriguing book. So if you've never looked at it, it's online, it's available, you can go on Google Books, you can find it quite easily, or you can buy still the translations that are still made. I think the last one was made in 1989 by Howard C. Rice, so that's a good English translation. It was translated at the time as well. That's the copy you can see there, that's the 1787, I believe, edition. So you can see this is a natural bridge, that's a drawing that he had made, of course, by someone else. Anyway, so this book was very intriguing to me, and I started to read more about Châtelus, trying to find out who he really was, and I found that there is not much about him besides him being quoted by many historians for this travel journal, but for the rest there's just not much to find. So I thought maybe there's something more to find in the castle. And so I went back to Philippe and asked him if he might have some archives. And he actually said, well, I do. In the middle you can see that square tower. And he explained to me that it was sort of a nightmare to him because he had inherited this huge castle, 76 rooms, and one of the main things is that there are 700 years of archives in that tower. It is organized, but it's just so much. It's all the different people. Every one of his family has papers. And so I said, okay, but I will be so happy to go, and can we please have a look in the archive? I said, okay, let's go. So we went, and you have to go to a spiral staircase, lots of dust, a lot of dead flies specifically. No one really ever goes in that place, so it's almost scary to open that door. But quite quickly we found a big sort of box with the words François Jean. So we're like, okay, that's the one, that's where we have to go. And so we put it on one of these tables, we opened the first maps, and one of the first things we saw was George Washington's name. So we thought, okay, let's open it. And there were 8 original letters of George Washington in the map. Then the following one was Thomas Jefferson, 13 letters. And then Benjamin Franklin. And I have a slide here with all the different names. But a lot of, these American, what you would call founding fathers of the time. I see I made a mistake on the word Adams, but okay. And so also with a few of the continental officers, of course, and then a lot with French, which was more surprising to me. A lot of letters from Voltaire, from Diderot, from D'Alembert, so the French enlightened philosophers, and a lot of others, but also politicians of the time. And of course, Rochambeau, Lafayette, La Luzerne was the French ambassador based in Philadelphia, and a lot of others too. So quite easily you could understand there was something with the American Revolution, but there was also the French Enlightenment. He was related to the French courts because he was writing, as you can see, for example, Vergennes and Necker, these are the ministers of the French King Louis XVI. So his network became apparent very quickly through all these correspondences. Then there were also letters with David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and a lot of other people that are little less known, but they're Italian or German people. So they were a very interesting combination of all these different letters. Of course, were extremely exciting to find, but also very inspiring to continue this research. So this is when I moved to Paris and started my PhD project to continue and to really dig into this person, Châtellus. And one of my main questions has always been, how is he so connected? What did he do? And what does it mean to have this combination between this philosophical side and the military side? And so a few letters to show you the exciting finds and the more intriguing ones too is that, for instance, here's a letter of George Washington that he wrote at the end of the campaign. So when Châtellus left, meaning he went back to France. So there was a whole letter saying that they had a deep and lasting friendship, a friendship with neither time nor distance can ever eradicate. Washington writes this to Châtellus at the departure of Châtellus, so it's sort of this last farewell letter, but it is an unusual tone for George Washington. He wrote a lot of letters, of course, to say goodbye and thank you for what you've done, but this was a serious, deep bond. You can see in all their other letters that they are actually very close throughout their campaign, and especially also later, so they continue to write up until Châtellu's death in 1788. By the way, 1788, of course, just before the revolution. Always everyone will ask, what did he do in the French Revolution? Well, he was already, maybe luckily for him, he just passed away, naturally. Anyway, so George Washington and Châtellus have a very intriguing friendship based on a lot of common interests that went way beyond their military interests, which I'll come back to later. Thomas Jefferson wrote to Châtellu's wife when he had passed away that I had for him a very sincere esteem, which had commenced with our acquaintance here, being in America, and had grown under a very intimate intercourse with him in France. They indeed had a very deep friendship as well, especially when Jefferson became the ambassador, of course, in Paris. Châtellus and him spent a lot of time together. So these are just two examples of the most sort of famous, but it is a very intriguing collection to understand the French-American relations, of course, of the time, and especially this role of this quite unknown man, or at least for me he was, and to understand also more of the details of this French-American campaign that was so obviously more than just a military campaign, let's say. I will focus only on the military side today, though, but okay. So François Châtellus, you can see some of course, portraits of the time, so from him, from a younger period to an older period. One of the paintings is, of course, a Peel painting that's in Philadelphia, but the rest is in their private collection today of the chateau. And so, who is Châteauneuf? He's describing himself to Jeremy Bentham in a letter, where he calls himself a soldier, but also someone who was part of the Republic of Letters. And then at the end of this quote, he says, I have friends. So what's interesting about him, he is this combination of a soldier and a philosopher, and he has this very important network. So you can see this figure being interesting in his own period for that reason, because of course he is much more than just a general, let's say. So as a soldier, he participated in the 7 Years' War, in the German campaigns of the French king, at the time Louis XV, and he rose from a lieutenant to very, very problematic for me to say colonel always, because I feel colonel, but anyway, colonel, in the 7 Years' War. So he had his own regiment called the Régiment de Châteauneuf at the end of the war, which of course was a very complicated war for the French generals and officers and soldiers that of course lost terribly. One of the main reasons for them, of course, to support the American Revolution afterwards. So during this time, Châteauneuf saw how bad it went for his army and started to think, how can we reform our army? How can we prevent another defeat as bad as the one we have just suffered? And he was, by the way, fighting alongside Rochambeau. They switched regiments, so Rochambeau got his older regiment and Châteauneuf got the other one, so they're actually very close during a few months of the 7 Years' War, and they're fighting in the same battles. And he's also fighting alongside Viaumenil, who is that other person I'll talk about later, and with La Luzerne, who would become the French ambassador. So what's interesting once you start digging into some individuals is to realize that they have fought, they're all veterans of the 7 Years' War, have fought together, and then have actually gone through this kind of traumatism of losing so badly against, of course, the coalition of the Prussians and the British, but especially to think, how can we change our army? And especially him and Rochambeau are writing many reports on changing their army and to improve it based on Enlightenment ideas, which is my new book. Anyway, so, and he was also part, besides being thinking in this more enlightened way about changing the French army, for instance, on more meritocracy, paying soldiers more to motivate them further, to give them chances of rising in the army ranks, for instance, were one of his, let's call them techniques to improve the army. But he was also writing a lot of different subjects, such as poetry, the union of poetry and music, so lyrics on music and how that could be improved. And especially he compared the French and Italian languages in that book. And then his sort of bestseller was called De la Félicité Publique, translated in English as On Public Happiness, which was widely circulating in the United States during the American Revolution. And for instance, Washington and Jefferson and all these had their own copies of the book. Then he was continuing, so 84, as you can see, that's of course a year after American independence was achieved, he wrote about animal magnetism. So he wrote about all these different subjects as, of course, one of these very typical enlightened men touching on all these different subjects. But this explains his role in America. That's why I'm telling all this, is because when he arrived here, a lot of these people wanted to meet him. They were interested in meeting the philosopher of France. Most of these people, such as Voltaire, that everyone knew, or Montesquieu, that of course everyone knew too, had never been to America, because it was not a sort of normal thing to just cross the Atlantic. They had all written about America, but in imaginative ways. So the fact that now one of these people, like let's call that sort of the club of the philosophes, actually went to America was really fascinating for Americans that were, of course, very inspired by the French ideas. And so this, what I just said, is the fact that he combined all these different ideas about improvement of society and imposing them of the improvement of the army is something that he was doing his entire life. He started doing it when he was 16 years old. He was already doing research and trying to understand how can we make this army better, because it was really not functioning anymore based on a lot of problems I will not go into, but he wrote about 40 different reports that he sent to Louis XV and then Louis XVI, who was actually listening to him. He was advising him in a sort of informal capacity, but if you see the different letters that he received from the king at one point too, but more of his ministers of war and of the navy. He was influential with his thoughts, and there were a lot of reforms in the army in which he was influential at the time. So okay, this was just as a sort of introduction to him, but we'll of course go to the American Revolution now. And a good quote to introduce that is Benjamin Franklin to Châteauroux after the campaign, the Yorktown campaign. So he writes, "I congratulate you on the success of your last glorious campaign," of course, Yorktown. "A philosopher endowed with those strong sentiments of humanity that are manifested in your excellent writings must enjoy great satisfaction in having contributed so extensively by his sword as well as by his pen to la félicité publique, public happiness." So he's recognized by Franklin as being this combination between this military and philosopher, and as we can see, he really did play an important role in Yorktown. So, American Revolution, this is actually his own map, you can see of Châteauroux, his own travels. And so, I don't have to tell you all this of all the different phases, but just so that we know, we're focusing now on the years, I made a mistake there, 1781, I meant 1780, but of course Rochambeau, so Châteauroux is part of the Rochambeau campaign, and Châteauroux was the major general. We'll talk more about what that means, but he was mainly in charge of logistics, and he was very close to Rochambeau, advising him on many things, but he was mainly also the liaison officer between the Continental Army and the French army, mainly because he spoke English very well. According to himself, that was because he was befriended with David Hume and wanted to be able to converse with him in his own language, and so he had learned English, but he was actually very good at it, especially compared to Rochambeau, who did not speak English. So of course they arrive in July 1780, and then what we'll see is he's very much involved in a sort of whole preparation phase of Yorktown that is way longer than you might think. And then of course March to Yorktown, battle, surrender, all these things happen. But what's interesting is when the French arrive in July of 1780 in Newport, Rhode Island, is that it's a very complicated alliance. I'm sure you've all heard about this problematic beginning of the alliance, because when the French arrive in Newport, as they would expect, they wanted to receive these cheering crowds that were happy that the French army finally came, and that just didn't happen. People were quite suspicious of these French. What were they really wanting to do? They were Catholics. Did they want to impose Catholicism on New Englanders, maybe? Were they indeed sort of weird, effeminate beings eating frogs and snails, as some of the reports, of course, were discussing? Were they as arrogant as they were known for? But of course, all these prejudices that are quite funny to us, but they were real. They were circulating, especially in the British press, to, of course, make this alliance more complicated. But it was especially because during the 7 Years' War, the French had been fighting against, of course, the American population that had been at the time in the British army. And so there's a lot of differences there, but especially also the cultural differences. These French, specifically the officers, are of course from the higher aristocracy of the French court, Versailles. You have to imagine that huge castle. Châteauroux, as you had seen, was living in that chateau. Rochambeau as well. All the real aristocracy from France. They arrive in Newport and like, what is this place? They call it a rocky mountain, or they call it sort of an isolated rock in the middle of nowhere, far away from the periphery. They call it the periphery of civilization. It does sound a little arrogant, as their reputation was, but at the same time it was very different, of course, from what they were known, and especially their ally was extremely different. They were used to these European, magnificent, very old armies with the uniforms, with all the training. And then they saw what they called the army dressed in rags. So they were really quite shocked by what they found. So we can see that in letters from Châteauroux, that is actually writing to the Minister of War of his time. So he's writing a report called On the State of Our Army. He is alarmed. He wants to really shake Versailles. A lot of people do this, by the way. This is not just Châteauroux. A lot of his the other officers around him are writing similar reports to really say, like, what are we doing here? This is a terrible idea. So he said, we wanted to crush the English and we thought the occasion favorable. But all in all, we have contracted an alliance with rebel subjects. We will have to feed, clothe, pay the Americans and even fight for them. So he is disappointed, as we can see. He's also disappointed about himself, I mean, his own army specifically. He said the aid we sent in America is very, very mediocre and unlikely to give an advantageous opinion on our strength to our new ally. He's afraid that the Americans will not take this French aid seriously because it's not enough. They expect, so there were around 6,000 men, of course, that came. They were expecting still 2,000 to come, and the Navy, they just didn't come. They were waiting for these extra men, for the extra ships specifically, and they were afraid that the Americans would be just disappointed by them as well. So from both sides, he was very aware this is not going to work. Of course, skip forward to September, where Rochambeau and Washington meet for the first time to discuss the problematic situation they're in. Both the Americans and the French know that they don't have enough troops to start with to attack the British. They especially don't have enough ships. There's a huge lack of money from both sides. That's sometimes something we forget. The French also had not a very limited amount of money with them from the French king. And they were very quite frustrated and afraid of what they could walk into if they would immediately start to attack New York City, as of course was one of the main desires of George Washington. This is all quite a well-known story of, okay, why do they go instead of to New York, what kind of this main desire was, how do they go to Yorktown? So I don't want to go too much in that, but there's one reason that's kind of forgotten, which is relating to Châteauroux. So I'll focus on that specific aspect of this choice, the decision-making, because I'm sure you know, but the first sort of idea was to go to New York. Washington wanted that because it was the main symbolic power of the British. Of course, they were having their strongholds there since 1776, when they had really defeated Washington's army very badly. They had fortified the whole city, and attacking New York specifically could mean the final blow of the American Revolution. But then there was always the other alternative plan being the southern states, of course, where we are now, but it's specifically because, of course, the Continental Army was suffering defeats there, but also it could just be another place to start and attack the British. So there were two options. They were both discussed, but unfortunately, they also concluded this is not the right time. Let's wait until new enforcement come, and especially more money and the Navy. So in September, so of course, the French arrive in July, and they were hoping for a campaign, but there is just no campaign possible. So they're going to go into their winter quarters in Newport. And there's a lot of books written about this question of going to Yorktown or to New York, but often it's portrayed as if Washington is kind of obsessed by taking New York, and that Rochambeau is manipulating him in lots of different ways to actually go to Newport, which is, Yorktown, of course, but to go to Yorktown, because that's sort of the image it gives if you look at all the different aspects combined. But if you look at Châteauroux's reports and re-evaluate some of the other letters, you can see it's much more nuanced than that. It's not really a battle between the two generals. It's more that it's a very long and very rational sort of longer process, and it's collaboration. It's actually happening together. Based on common understanding of the dangers, based on waiting for new numbers of soldiers, because of course British are outnumbering the combined French-American forces, so they're waiting and waiting for new information, and so they're basing their choices on something much more rational than you sometimes read in other accounts. I'm basing this mainly on our friend Châteauroux, because Châteauroux was the initiator of a research mission that has now been quite forgotten because it was a secret mission. But if you read his papers, and especially all the reports that followed this mission, you can really see what the French and Americans did in a very small group, because this is what it was. They were not enough informed, he believed. So he was writing that one report where he was saying everything is going wrong, we can't do anything. He's actually writing secretly to his sister, like, I want to go away, I want to go back to France, I don't know how to even do this. But so he finds one solution and says it would be necessary that one or more officers of the army of Rochambeau, together with officers of the army of Washington, would enlighten the ambassador La Luzerne. The ambassador La Luzerne is based in Philadelphia, and one of the problems, according to Châteauroux, is that he is not well informed. He does not know what's all happening in America. They don't know the American army that well. They don't know all these different states where they're located. they need better maps, they need better ideas of provision possibilities, they need ideas on roads to walk on, so they just need information. So he said these officers would travel, so French and Americans together would travel in the country, see the army, and measure the disposition of the people. And indeed, this is what he's going to do. Of course, he's talking about this with Rochambeau, who is telling him, okay, you can do this. And he's going to do a long tour of the continent. So one of the products of this tour is his travel diary, but that's more sort of a reflection of his own things he's done, like mainly at night, and the fun evenings he spent with all these people he's describing. But he was actually doing a very serious research tour of America. So they went to Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Virginia on this tour. And so there's sort of a step 1 and step 2. The step 2 will be New York itself. So during this winter, of course, you have to imagine it's very cold, like today. He's describing the terrible weather, all the snow he has to go through, but they're going for this mission. And he's bringing people with him along the road. They're not all the time together. Well, he is with the people you can see, with specifically Montesquieu, Lynch, Dumas, and Turpin are very often with him. But then on the road, they meet often with people such as Knox, Hamilton, Humphreys, Lafayette, and Washington himself. And so what he's doing, Châteauneuf, with this sort of research team, he's calling them the Gallo Americans, is that they are gathering everything you can imagine. They're going to old battlefields to see, okay, what happened, what can we learn from this, what can we learn from the terrain, from the American army's different tactics, what can we learn about the British, of course, too. He's looking at geography, topography. They're making a lot of maps that are mainly held today in the Library of Congress in DC, but also in Châteauneuf's collection there were a few maps that reflect that. And then he was also doing a lot of research on the Continental Army, so all the different units. He was going to see how are they organized, what can we learn there. But especially, maybe more surprising, they were including in these military reports a lot of details about agriculture, trade, religion, culture, languages, different customs. So they were really doing a serious, in-depth research of who are these Americans we have to fight with? Are they so different than we are? Are all these prejudices sort of true based on something, or are they, of course, maybe more false? And they do, during this research mission, together with these American officers, realize that it's all not that bad. If they go out of Newport and Rhode Island, they realize that there are some fortifications, for instance, West Point, they're marveled at because they realize it's built so fast, of course, with some French aid as well, but they're realizing that the Americans are capable of a lot of military actions, or they can see the army units doing their maneuvers or performing some drills, and they realize they're actually better trained than they expected. They realize they're actually already sort of veterans of the years that were before. They have fought lots of battles, and so on and so on. They can also see that some less sort of European tactics are useful to win battles. So they start to think, these people are actually way better than we expected. They also see, for instance, the huge development of agriculture, which to them is a real symbol for the growth of the United States, for the population growth that will follow, for the, of course, options for France to participate in the trade after the war. Religion is very much more diverse than they expected, also less sort of pressing, because they thought, okay, we're very much the enemy as a Catholic nation, but then they realized it's different actually on that side too. The culture was very different in lots of different places, so it was not sort of this backward culture. They actually found a lot of culture and science and education, and lots of these people that they met along the road were way more what they could consider cultured or more intellectual than they expected. So all these elements led to a real shift in the minds of the French specifically, but also I think of the Americans who also got to know these French better by doing this research together. One of the highlights for Châteauneuf here, and one of the real turning points for him too, is meeting George Washington as the general, because an army under his command is something we can trust for him. This is just a fun little anecdote, but he meets him because Lafayette is introducing him to him at something that's today still a place to visit called the Day Mansion. But he says, a few glasses of claret and Madeira accelerated the acquaintances I had to make, and I soon felt myself at my ease near the greatest and best of men. Wow. So they spent quite some time drinking all these fun glasses, but also talking about all the different things that are of interest to them. And this is when Chateauneuf and Washington become close, because they realize there's so much more to them than their mission, of course, to defeat the British. They're interested in theater, they're interested in agriculture, they're interested in the sciences, development of education, all these different topics.